Neither of my parents or my siblings were interested particularly in music outside of just appreciating, what it was about. And my father was always bringing classical records, classical music records, and into the household. And that was the first time that I had an exposure to what we would call Western art music. And in those days, prior to the internet age, obviously, there wasn't as much in the area of the country that I grew up in. It was a small town in Iowa that actually was particularly stimulating in the direction of the arts. But from a very early age, my parents told me later, at least, that anything to do with music, I was strongly drawn to. And I do remember that around the age of 6 or 7, I was insisting on beginning piano lessons. It came from somewhere within myself, and it wasn't anything that was imposed upon me. So my parents, they, in a way, took me seriously, but they didn't take the request very seriously, so I had to keep pushing. And it seemed to be, at my insistence almost completely, that I eventually found myself taking lessons from the piano teacher around the corner. And she was a nurse by profession, but she would occasionally give lessons to children in the neighborhood. And that's how it began for me. And so I worked with her for 4 years, and then eventually went to another teacher around the age of 11 or 12 in Omaha, Nebraska, which was the biggest city nearby. And from that point through my high school years, I was the only student of a woman who had taught for years in Omaha and had lived out her whole life in the environs of that city. But she was very sophisticated, and I think she had a great deal of patience for me, because as a youngster, my enthusiasm was sort of boundless, but I had not much in the way of discipline. And so I loved practicing, I loved learning repertoire, I sight read everything, but I didn't really know what it meant to be aiming for or attempting to reach a professional standard until I went away to college, after my high school had been completed in that area. And gradually, that's when my path into the profession, of course, like most people, began to actually form in a serious way. Yes, it was very specific, probably because in the basement of our house, my grandmother had, when she had passed away, had left her piano. It was an upright, and so my mother inherited her mother's instrument, and that's what I was, the reason I was exposed to the piano in the first place. And I don't think it's unusual for children to gravitate towards the piano, and there's immediacy about it, and it's something that you have sort of complete charge over the music that you get to play. You're not just training yourself to be part of a larger ensemble. Those simple facts in terms of what was there in our household is probably the reason. In my school, to a certain extent, I went through the Catholic school systems in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and throughout my grade school and high school years, the music programs were not very developed. But I was identified as, someone who could play the piano. I was more advanced than anybody else around, including the teachers, I suppose. And also in my church, at a very early stage, I was asked to be the organist. And I didn't really have a lot of serious training for this work, but I had a kind of raw talent or ability that allowed me to do the job that was asked of me. And so, yes, in this respect, I was involved with the music programs, I said, but they were not at all sophisticated. And in fact, I think one of the things that I can fairly say in growing up, that my passion for the piano and for music in general was something that I was unable to sort of share with colleagues my own age because nobody else had this interest. So I was truly isolated in an educational sense, except my curiosity, of course, was sort of explosive. And I would find myself being pulled for social reasons into the interests and hobbies and activities of all my colleagues at the time, and did so gladly. I got involved, like everybody else, in sports and whatever it was in the school, lineup of extracurricular activities, that newspaper editorship, things like that, student government. But music remained my number one love, and it was something that burned strongly enough inside of me that it would have been nice to have shared this with others in those years, but it was something I had to sort of just keep to myself. So it was an interesting mixture of circumstances that are somewhat unheard of these days, because everything is so thoroughly interconnected no matter where you are. The information age, as we call it, but in those days that was not the case. My parents were, at the time you don't realize it, of course, when you're a child, but with some distance on those years and looking back on my upbringing, they were wonderfully supportive from the sidelines. They didn't pretend to understand what it was that I was doing, but they sure were always there giving me whatever support was necessary, just moral support. The financial, my family was not well off particularly, but my dad insisted that the one thing that he provided for his children was anything in the area of education. And so his son, the pianist, it had to do with lessons and whatever I needed in terms of music and recordings, things like that. So yes, they were, in a certain way, in the best sense, they were passive and just stayed out of my way, but they made it very clear that what was important to me was important to them. It's an interesting dynamic. Well, neither of my parents had college education, and yet the thing that was instilled in all of us as their children was the importance of education, and as much as we could engage with, as many years as we needed to do so. And I remember my father saying to me once that he said, "I will support you in whatever endeavor you choose for as long as I need to. But if you decide to change, I'm not sure if I can do it twice." So he also, in his way, I suppose, was telling us that what we felt passionate about was really what we needed to follow. And it was an interesting way of putting it, but I remember when he said that to me, and I heard it more than once, but I thought, it doesn't sound mean-spirited, it doesn't sound cruel. It actually started, I thought, well, of course I wouldn't dream of doing anything else.